This is GovExec Daily, where we bring you the federal stories that really matter. It's April 6th, 2023. I'm Ross John Fortuna. High unemployment is rightfully seen as a negative in communities, and the images of blighted neighborhoods during fallow times are easy to imagine. Tight labor markets, however, have not received the same scrutiny, nor do they produce the same mental images. Times like early 2020, when a 50-year low in unemployment lifted the wages of the lowest paid workers, are not as well known, nor are their effects on low-income Americans. In a new book, our guests today study the ways that tight labor markets impact communities, workers, and society. Katherine S. Newman is Provost and Executive Vice President of Academic Affairs at the University of California. She's also the author of 14 books. And Elisabeth S. is Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute and co-founder of WorkRise, for which she serves as Deputy Director. They are the authors of Moving the Needle, What Tight Labor Markets Do for the Poor, which looks at what happens when jobs are ample, but workers are harder to find. After a short break, they'll join the podcast to discuss the book.
This coming July marks an exciting milestone for Defense One with its 10-year anniversary. Join Defense One in celebrating a decade of award-winning journalism, covering the topics and trends that have defined the future of U.S. defense and national security. With powerful moments in programming taking place throughout 2023, we will revisit the key players, stories, and voices that have defined the past 10 years, while looking forward to what the next 10 years could bring to the state of defense. To learn more about how your brand can plug into this historic year-long celebration, please contact solutions@govexec.com.
It almost seems too obvious to say, but inadequate employment levels play a huge role in poverty levels of communities. In a time of staggeringly disparate economic indicators in the pandemic-era United States, the question of low unemployment rates demands further examination. Our guests today have co-authored a book that explores just this topic and more. Moving the Needle, What Tight Labor Markets Do for the Poor, looks at what happens when jobs are ample, but workers are harder to find. Katherine S. Newman is Provost and Executive Vice President of Academic Affairs at the University of California. She's also the author of 14 books. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
And Elisabeth S. is a Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute and co-founder of WorkRise, for which she serves as Deputy Director. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So why did you write the book? Katherine, let's start with you.
You know, in the long history of the study of poverty that social scientists have been poring over for eons, the role of employment in poverty has been very clear, but mostly the focus has been on what it means when employment is hard to secure or when wages are very, very low, and you have a large number of people who are excluded from the labor market. What really attracted us to this topic is that we are experiencing a 52-year low in unemployment. And as far as we could determine, nobody else was asking the question, what does that mean for the poor? And it means an enormous amount. It changes the opportunity structure in dramatic ways and provides opportunity for income to come into households that have historically been on the receiving end of very bad news in the labor market. It's not perfect, but it's very meaningful. And it is important for everyone to recognize just how much both the poor and the country have to benefit from tight labor markets. And so that's why we did it.
Well, what kind of assumptions did you have going into researching this topic? And similarly, what kind of surprises hit you while you were researching and writing the book, the whole project?
Well, I think we assumed that this would be good news in that most of the time the poor are looking at a very impoverished kind of opportunity structure. So we thought there would be more opportunity, and we've both studied the low wage labor market for a long time and have spent a lot of time looking at people's lives whose options were very limited to low wage, fast food work or retail, and seen them struggle to try and find better jobs. And so the assumption we had going in was, with a 52-year low of unemployment, there's probably more opportunity. What we didn't anticipate, and what was really surprising to us, was how radically employers have to adapt to the changing labor market. That is, when employers face scarcity of workers, it completely changes how they recruit, who they recruit, how much they invest into training, what kind of internal ladders of upward mobility they offer. They are, in a sense, forced to do better in order to attract the people that they need. And while I think we might have recognized that in the abstract, in the concrete, it's really quite striking. And I think those are among the more surprising findings in this book. Elisabeth, do you want to add anything to that?
I think my only addition on top of that would be, it was surprising to us how quickly things bounced back after the pandemic ebbed a bit, right? Because we started working on this book in a very tight labor market prior to the pandemic. We had no idea that a historic global pandemic was going to completely upend economies, and in particular labor markets, and extra in particular exactly the kind of folks that we were looking at and whose lives we were really invested in better understanding. And I think if you'd asked either one of us in March of 2020, what's going to happen to this book project? Like, what do you make of your research that's halfway done? We would have both, I mean, we had many a conversation that was like, who knows, right? This is just, it's a roller coaster that we're on, and it's exciting to be in the middle of it, but who knows where it will go. I don't think either one of us would have predicted that the underlying strength of the labor market and the forces that were going on, and candidly, the policy response would have kind of snapped things back to essentially very close to the momentum that was going on beforehand, and that we've continued to see. So I would add that on top of what Katherine has noted as an additional surprise.
Well, let's sort of talk about some of the conclusions and some of the things that come out of the book and the research and work that you've done. I guess from a bird's eye view, what are the consequences of these tight labor markets versus the slack labor markets on job seekers? And I guess from a little bit further out perspective on communities, I know, there's a lot of talk of things like gentrification and things like that. How does that factor in here with the cause and effect?
So let's start out with job seekers. The first thing that happens is that people who've been on the margins and haven't really had much of a opportunity to find success in the labor market suddenly discover they are actually wanted. People whose backgrounds, especially their recent employment histories, have been rocky and who've been shut out in earlier periods of slack labor markets suddenly discover they're getting multiple offers. And that is a very welcome surprise for them. And that would include people who've been long-term unemployed. It would include single mothers. It includes returning citizens coming out of the prison system. These are people who would have historically been turned away, and suddenly they find they are desirable, and that employers really want them and are willing to invest in them. So that is a real surprise for them. It also means that not having formal credentials, which would have been one of the reasons why they were shut out, is not nearly as much of a barrier as it was before. So when you hit very tight labor markets, you start to see the requirements for entry loosen up. And suddenly, you don't really need a college degree anymore, or you don't need a decade of experience, because when employers can't find anybody to work for them, they start taking another look at those entry requirements. And so that the combination of tightness and job seekers starting to recognize that there's actually more opportunity out there for them is really a noticeable change for them. The other thing that happens is that intermediaries in the labor market, and these are, people who run job placement programs, sometimes they're nonprofits, sometimes they're for-profits. Long ago, people would have recognized Kelly Girls as a name. You have to be at my age to remember it, but these were temp employment agencies, would have been nothing more than churning through temporary employees. When labor markets tighten, those temp agencies become resources for permanent employment. So employers will go to them and hope that they can recruit through them people who will stick with them permanently. So it just opens up this huge, opportunity profile, and not just for entry, but for upward mobility internally, because of the investments in training that employers begin to invoke. In terms of communities, this was a key question for us as researchers interested in the social scientific study of poverty, because one of the kind of watchwords of that whole literature is that when you've got a large number of people who are unemployed, a high proportion of people who are unemployed, you get instability in neighborhoods, you get crime problems, you get trouble on the streets. And so we were interested in trying to learn, does that reverse? Are there any signs of reversal at the community level when you've got many more people or higher proportion of people employed? And what we found was, yes, there's a lot of evidence that these communities start to stabilize. I'm going to go on in a moment for the things that complexify that observation, but at least at the first blush, you have much more stability in the streets. You have daycare centers who say, we can take our kids outside now. We can say, we can see that you've got more money coming into households because men who previously been unemployed and couldn't contribute to the care of their children, even if they were, separated or distinct from the household, start to put more money into those households. They can do so, and they do. So neighborhoods start to stabilize in ways that are very positive. We've got lots and lots of reports in the book of daycare directors, longtime residents of neighborhoods that were very poor, very troubled, very high crime 20 years ago, saying, wow, things have really changed. We can take the kids outside now. People are friendlier to each other. There's not as much tension on the streets. And we can see a more orderly life in the children we're taking care of, right? Their parents just seem better adapted to the situation, although they are now working so hard that they may feel more pressured and a little bit more time conscious because they've got so much employment now that they got to factor that into their household lives. That said, the same thing that fuels tight labor markets also fuels gentrification, because as you get rents rising, especially in cities like Boston, which is where we did all the field work for this project, the more those rents rise in response to economic growth, the more you get people, more affluent people, pushing out into neighborhoods they didn't used to venture into, increasing rents in those neighborhoods and creating pressure on people who don't have secure housing. So if housing is not secure, and it can be secure in a lot of ways, public housing projects are secure in their own way, rent stabilized can be secure in its own way, but if they're not those avenues of security, you can start to see a lot of outflow. The final thing I will say is that we see in these communities that were so poor before and were banking deserts, shopping deserts, underserved, they start to see more services coming into those neighborhoods, in part because people have a bit more money to spend. So they are more of a target for commercial development. And they will say things like, there didn't used to be any bank within, walking distance of my house, or there were no stores where I could shop for anything other than like bodega food, which is expensive and not usually the full range. Now there's a supermarket here. So all of that is to the good. However, some of the other things that come along with gentrification is a feeling that maybe it's not exactly my neighborhood anymore. And so some of the desires people have to have more political say over the future of their community begins to feel a little bit more like it's a contest moving into other hands. I don't know if Elisabeth, you want to add to that or.
No, I'll let you have the last word on that one. I think that was pretty comprehensive. That was great.
Okay.
I love it, and we've seen this with after school programs too, and teen violence and stuff. I love it when idioms get made real, and employment levels certainly speak to the idle hands are the devil's playthings type stuff. Yeah. Let's sort of shift a little bit and touch on some policy stuff that you mentioned. I know particularly with the Fed has been a little bit more active in its intervention in the economy, trying to balance inflation, employment numbers. How do you see that playing out, and what's that going to mean for these types of communities that you studied?
That I think is a really critical question, and I will pull Elisabeth into this in a moment. But my first observation is that the Fed has been jacking up interest rates at a pretty rapid clip, and it hasn't made much of a difference in these labor market numbers. And that is a solution truly to be wished for. I mean, I hope it doesn't, because there is so much to gain by giving people a long runway into the labor market and the opportunity to capitalize on experience and begin moving into realms that will leave them a little bit less vulnerable to future layoffs. Now, obviously there are economists and policymakers who believe that the only way out of inflation is to see a huge spike in unemployment. And, I sometimes wonder if they're thinking about what the long-term cost of that unemployment will actually be, because it doesn't help stabilize families. It doesn't lead to higher educational attainment. It doesn't lead to labor market prosperity in the future. And so I worry that that short-term solution will produce long-term losses and costs. But so far, we're not seeing it anyway. So there are two things I would say that I find, I'm not an economist, neither of us are, but that I find interesting and puzzling. First, not all tight labor markets lead to inflation, right? We began this book in a long period of time when unemployment was just going down, 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 and there wasn't any sign of inflation at all. And I would say that in the Clinton years, the same thing was true. Very high levels of employment, no inflation to speak of at all, high levels of economic growth. So these things don't always go together. And similarly, the remedies that have been used by the Fed lately in terms of interest rates haven't produced much change in the labor market. I mean, I know there's been a lot of attention to tech layoffs because they're concentrated and they're hitting people who read newspapers. But it's kind of a blip if we're looking out there. And in particular, the wage increases have been greatest at the very bottom. And that is an outcome truly to be wished for. So I would be very alarmed. I think Elisabeth and I were very concerned about policies that would preserve the gains of tight labor markets. But so far, I don't see too many losses out there. Elisabeth, you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo on top of that, there's new data that just came out. I think it came out yesterday. I've lost track of my days of the week, but showing that wage growth has slowed, but it's still out there. And at the same time, inflationary pressure has really cooled off. And we saw that with the Fed announcing, again, I think it was as today, I've lost track of my days, but announcing another rate increase, but a much smaller one. And kind of, I think in some ways, sort of settling into this idea that maybe we're heading into the soft landing that macroeconomists have been crossing their fingers and hoping for, which to Katherine's point, I think is something we were very much hoping to see, because pitting price stability against employment and really using rising unemployment as a way of measuring success feels like a very short-sighted metric if you're trying to understand the health of the economy for actual humans, which is, I think, what most of us, when it comes down to, would like to measure progress by.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, when people do turn to high levels of unemployment as the solution to inflation, the long-term costs of that are enormous. We tend not to calculate them in because they're not the same kind of economic variable. But if we see rising incarceration, if we see lower educational attainment, we will see lower productivity. There's a million knock-on consequences to high unemployment, none of which are healthy or sustainable for our country. They lead to higher levels of inequality and way, way more what I would call remedial expenses that are really costly and usually not very effective. Better for us not to get there in the first place. Keep people in the labor market, keep them gaining skill, keep them piling up experience that can lead to higher degrees of upward mobility and greater, contributions and investments in the next generation.
It's almost like the investor class is not the only people in the United States.
Well,
I know that's hard to believe.
Right?
Particularly, I say this is, people who listen to our show for the most part are relatively high GS levels, and certainly people who work for contractors, things like that. So I'm not trying to stick my finger in the eye of our listeners, but there are, 350 million people in this country, and not everybody is only tied to whatever the Dow is or the whatever. And I know he's a punching bag, but whatever Larry Summers says about unemployment numbers, I know you cite him in part of the book. So we'll end on the idea of a policy going forward. What can sort of be enacted that would encourage, these kind of labor markets and this kind of outcome?
So we have a whole chapter of the book that is on that, and Elisabeth is really the better authority here. But I don't want to tax your fever. Maybe you can just list a few things, and I can come in on the back end of that one.
Sure. And I actually almost jumped in at the end of that last conversation just to say that even in the wake of rising unemployment, there are a fair number of things that happen. Nothing ever happens naturally, but somewhat more organically because incentives are aligned when labor markets are tight, particularly around employer practices, but some other things that we can touch on as well. And I think there are lessons to learn, and I'll get specific in a second, but I think there are some lessons to learn there in terms of what, if we wanted to kind of commit values and policy-wise, either at a public policy level or employers who really want to continue to put their money where their mouths are, that are pretty promising to hold on to. So one of those is second chance hiring, right? We have a whole chapter in the book that features a really phenomenal respondent who had a whole journey through prison and is now gainfully employed, upwardly mobile in really meaningful ways, in no small part thanks to the opportunities that opened up for him in a tight labor market where he was someone who never would have had a chance to get a foot in the door, and has now really moved up into something close to a managerial role. And that's something that we see happening. We see employers, I mean, there's a coalition led by the Business Roundtable and the JP Morgan Chase on second chance hiring. And there's been a big push around that. That all started in the context of these tight labor markets. It remains to be seen whether the combination of kind of necessity in terms of figuring out how to broaden the labor pool, combined with obvious social and cultural changes that have washed over the country in the last couple of years, allow that to endure, or whether we see that wither away. But the book and the research that we present provides a really strong case for, kind of regardless of what the labor market looks like, if you're taking a long view about talent development and inclusion, lots of kind of big picture things, both on an economic and a moral level that you might think are critical for society, things like second chance hiring, like being willing to hire folks who have a prior criminal record, things like clean slate legislation that would just wipe out folks' criminal records after they've served their time, and so it's no longer even an issue. There's a variety of policies in that space. Second, kind of in that same space around employer practice, is credentialing. We've seen Pennsylvania yesterday. Before Pennsylvania, you've seen Maryland and Utah governors erase the need for certain educational credentials across a huge number of state jobs, which has all of a sudden just revolutionized who's credible or who's a credible applicant, because it's based on skills as opposed to an educational credential, which was a real brick wall for a lot of folks who were kind of stuck at the bottom, but may have actually acquired some meaningful skills either on the job or through kind of non-traditional credentialing. There's federal legislation around exactly that I think is potentially of interest, and many of your listeners may know of it, that would do similar things or really codify some of the work that both the Trump and Biden administration were doing, again, in the context of a tight labor market, two very different administrations leaning into the same kind of policy solutions, and do that for federal jobs as well. So that's another example of practices that make a lot of sense when the macro context is saying, expand your labor pool, we need more workers, but there is absolutely no reason why in the context of a tighter labor market, those kind of decisions couldn't stay in place because of what we know they do in the medium and long run. And they can kind of buffer our way through recession. So I could go on a long time. There's a whole long list of other policies, but I will leave it at that. So those are two that I suspect will be especially relevant to folks listening. Katherine, I'll turn it back to you.
I'm just going to add, because of this special audience, as you probably know, there are restrictions on people with criminal records in working for any federally funded project. And there's a ton of federal construction money, especially given the Biden administration's emphasis on infrastructure. We need to get rid of those restrictions. Some of the cases that we cite in the book are people who would have done even better if they could have cracked that barrier. But as soon as it was known that they had a criminal record, they were excluded from federally funded projects. So in the Boston area, where there's a huge amount of biotech and a lot of laboratories being built, some of which are being built with federal funding, they had no chance of working on those construction projects. And I don't think it really is in anybody's interest to see that barrier remain. The one question that we were really interested in is whether employers who then gain a lot of experience with non-traditional workforce come to see this as a really viable resource for them. So instead of, Johnny being that one exceptional ex-con, Johnny comes to be part of a large number of people that employers say, you know what, that's a source for me. I'm going to keep tapping that source. And I do think the longer that tight labor markets exist, the more employers recognize there are pools they never tapped before and that they can, and it's productive. And in fact, their turnover rate is way lower and the promotion rate is higher than they ever expected. So this is one of the real benefits.
I'm going to jump in with one more piece at risk of talking over the host, which is never a good idea, but I do want to put on the table in the context of safety net programs and social insurance programs. This is something, again, that Katherine and I went back a fair bit about as we were writing that last chapter on policy implications, because so much of what we saw is that when folks actually have more support, they can climb the ladder more easily, right? So this idea that the safety net is for just like when things are absolutely awful and we're going to be as miserly about it as possible. I think, we aren't the first to make this argument with research, but we saw it in really real ways, both in the numbers and in our conversations with folks on the ground, that it makes a big difference. Having some extra money in your pocket allows you to invest in training, it allows you to plan your life, it allows you to take care of your family, it allows you to just live a fundamentally better life. And I think there are lessons there in terms of how we respond in the context of not only recession, but also safety net reform. And then on that point, the other thing that we heard over and over and over again, which probably shouldn't have surprised us, but I think it did, it's fair to say that it did, is that asset cliffs and benefit limits, and in particular, the way that that folks' family structures and the economic lives that folks who are living paycheck to paycheck have patched together lives and rely on family for income from multiple sources, rely on benefits from multiple sources in ways that aren't at all cheating, but are just necessary for actually keeping a roof over their head and being able to, have someone to take care of a child when they go to work. If you earn more, we have a system that's set up to essentially cut you off pretty quickly or ramp you down pretty quickly, including potentially risk losing your housing, which is a huge deal per our earlier comments about housing costs and gentrification. It's a really big deal and kind of threatens to shove people right off of a cliff right when they were starting to actually get a foothold. And so I think that's in the context of whether we've got ups and downs of the labor market or not, we have, and this is not new news to anyone who's worked in the benefits space, but we have a patchwork benefits program that also integrates really poorly with labor market-based opportunity ladders. And there is a huge opportunity to fix that. It is an uphill climb. We could have a whole separate hour-long conversation about the politics of safety net policies. That would be really fun. That's for another conversation. But for now, just recognizing that we're really short-sighted in this country, I think, about how we use safety net policy in particular as an opportunity kind of springboard. And there's a ton of room for improvement there. And I think the book has a lot to say about that to get a conversation started moving forward.
Yeah, I know certainly I don't know if I've ever put this on while the mics were hot, so we may have to delete this later. But, I've sort of spoken privately a lot about the transformative nature of the Great Society and stuff. And it did go hand in hand with a lot of tooling around with labor markets, but also bringing forward a safety net that was unforeseen in a generation. And so I would suggest reading the book, certainly when it comes out in April. I got a review copy because I'm fancy like that, but I think a lot of our listeners will really get a lot out of it, and even we didn't get to it, and I know we're up against time now, so I will let you go soon. But the workforce development side of it too can really, really help people on all sides of the spectrum, the labor spectrum, I guess I would say, the labor rungs. Thank you so much for being on the show with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to GovExec Daily. Our show was produced by Adam Butler and hosted by me, Ross John Fortuna. We want to thank Katherine Newman and Elisabeth Jacobs for joining the program. Our music is the song Signals by Catfish Dancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email us any feedback at podcast@govexec.com or hit us up on Twitter @govexec. Check us out on Facebook or LinkedIn by searching for Government Executive. We'd love to hear from you. We'll talk to you later.